The first time Will Granger saw her, she was a ghost against the gravel path. Just standing there at the edge of his broken-down ranch, thin arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her own bones together. Head down. Not a thing to her name but a threadbare satchel clutched in one hand. The wind was mean that day. It whipped her skirts and her long dark hair like it wanted to pull her apart and scatter her across the plains. But she didn't move. She stood her ground. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know where she'd crawled out from, or why she looked like she hadn't seen a real meal in a month of Sundays. All he knew was that his mother, inside the house, was fading fast. And she had sent for help. And this girl, this whisper of a woman, was what the world sent back. His ranch wasn't much anymore. The drought had turned half his pasture to dust. A storm last season had ripped a barn down to its spine. And inside the house, his mother, Alma Granger, was trapped in her bed. She was once a woman who could hold 1,000 acres together with sheer will, but her own body had turned traitor. The pain had hollowed out her cheeks and stolen the fire from her eyes. Will hadn't left the ranch in months, except to haul water or pick up what few supplies he could afford. He didn't have time for strangers. He sure as hell didn't have patience for them. But then the girl looked up. She looked at the sagging porch, her lips chapped and pale. Her eyes were shadowed, deep and dark, like she hadn't slept right in a year. And when she looked at his broken home, Will felt something strange in his chest, a silence he hadn't even known was there, suddenly cracking open. She introduced herself, her voice soft and plain, almost carried off by that same mean wind. "My name's Emma," she said. "I came from up near Warden. Heard you needed help." She didn't look him in the eye when she spoke, and Will didn't press. He just gave a short nod, stepped aside, and let the ghost walk into his house. Emma moved through the dying house like she was born to its silence. She didn't ask a single question. She didn't flinch at the layers of dust or the faint sour smell of sickness that clung to everything. Alma, his mother, watched her from the bed with sharp, suspicious eyes. Her voice was a dry crackle, pride still clinging to it like rust. "She's just a girl," Alma rasped to Will, the moment Emma stepped out to fetch water from the well. "What's she going to do here but die of the heat?" But Emma didn't die. She stayed. She wiped Alma's face with cool cloths, her touch impossibly gentle. She coaxed his mother to eat broth when Will himself had all but given up. She swept the floors without being told. She mended the old linens with stitches so fine you could barely see them. She even patched a leak in the roof with strips of old canvas she found in the collapsed barn. Will watched her from a distance. He was confused by how quiet she was, how steady. He wasn't used to it. Not since everything in his life had decided to fall apart. At night he'd sit on the back steps, staring out at the dark horizon where the cattle moved like slow black shadows. He thought of his father, who'd walked out without a word when Will was 17, leaving nothing behind but debt and silence. He thought of the brother he'd buried 4 years ago after the mine collapsed, the rock and earth taking him in one clean, brutal swallow. Will had learned the hard way not to get close to people. In his world, folks either left, or they died, or they changed into someone you didn't recognize. But every morning, Emma was still there. Her eyes were a little less shadowed, her movements a little less guarded. Still, there was something broken in her that wouldn't let go. Sometimes he'd catch her standing by the windmill, just staring into the distance. Not at the horizon, but at the road leading away from the ranch, like she was waiting for something terrible to follow her. When he asked her about it once, she just gave a tight little smile and shook her head. "Just thinking," she'd say. But Will knew that look. It was the look of someone who'd seen too much, someone who was always listening for footsteps behind them. He started to warm to her, slow and cautious, like an animal inching toward a fire. One morning, he walked in to find Emma and his mother bent over an old quilt. Alma's trembling hands were guiding Emma's through the stitching. And then he heard it. The first time in months. A dry, cracked sound. But it was real. His mother was laughing. Emma had that effect on the place. Like day by day she was pulling color back into a world that had gone gray. And still, Will kept his distance. Not out of coldness. out of fear. She was too young, too quiet, too haunted. He didn't know what ghosts rode on her shoulders, and he didn't know how to ask. What would he even say? Who broke you before you got here? He had no right, but the signs were everywhere. One night, he walked past her room and heard crying. It wasn't loud, it wasn't wild, just soft, careful sobs into her pillow, like she was trying to cry without making a sound, like she was trying not to exist. He stood outside her door for a long, long time, his fist clenched by his side, before he finally walked on. She never mentioned any family. She never wrote any letters. She never asked to go into town, and she never ever asked for anything for herself. Sometimes, after Alma had fallen asleep and all the chores were done, Emma would sit at the far end of the fence line. Her back would be to the house, her arms wrapped tight around her knees, staring toward the dark tree line like it held an answer she was desperate for. Will began to notice the little things, the things that told a story she wouldn't speak. She never sat with her back to a door. Ever. Her shoulders would bunch up tight at any sudden sound, a dropped pan, a door slamming in the wind. And she flinched. She flinched if a man got too close, too fast. Even him. Slowly, the dull ache in his chest that had started as curiosity began to turn into something deeper. It wasn't pity. He knew, somehow, that she would hate that. It was a kind of quiet, terrible respect. Because whatever had chewed her up and spit her out, it hadn't managed to take her kindness. One afternoon, he was fixing a fence near the west boundary, and he found her. She was standing over a dead rabbit, its neck snapped clean. Her hands were still trembling when she turned to him. "A fox got it," she whispered, but her voice was a million miles away. "Used to happen near our old place, too." But the way she stared down at that small broken thing, it was like she saw something else entirely. It made a cold dread trickle down Will's spine. She wasn't just looking at a dead animal. She was looking at a memory. Still, she stayed. Day after day she cooked and she cleaned and she cared for his mother. And she never once asked for anything in return. Not even safety. Not even a kind word. And maybe that's what broke Will more than anything else. That she never expected to be treated like a person. The days bled into weeks, and the weeks bled into a month. Alma's cough got worse. The nights grew colder. And Emma started doing something strange. She started leaving her window wide open at night, even when the wind was cold enough to bite. Will didn't ask why. He just started checking the perimeter of the ranch before he went to bed, his old shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. He told himself it was for coyotes. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. He knew she was listening for something. Or someone. Someone she'd heard about. Someone who was maybe still looking for her. And Will, who had spent his entire life shutting the world out, was starting to feel the pull of something he thought had died in him years ago. A need to protect. Not just because it was the right thing to do, but because he couldn't bear the thought of her leaving with that same broken look she'd had when she arrived. The ranch was still falling apart. The money was still thin. His mother was still fading. But for the first time in years, something inside Will Granger felt alive. The silence in the house wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with her. A quiet girl who showed up with nothing, and somehow, without ever asking for it, was mending everything he thought was broken for good. But he was about to find out that some things, once shattered, can't be put back together. They can only be swept away. Alma Granger had once been a force of nature, sharp-tongued and iron-willed, the kind of woman who could stare down a taxman without so much as blinking. But a stroke had come slow and mean, whittling her down, leaving her legs limp and her voice a slurred whisper. Her world had shrunk to the view from the parlor window, and she hated it. She hated needing help. Hated that Will had to carry her from her chair to her bed like she was a sack of grain. So when Emma arrived, quiet and soft-voiced, with hands that knew how to soothe a fever, it caught Alma off guard. At first she was suspicious. She thought the girl's silence was weakness, or worse, deceit. But Alma saw things. Even with her mind fogged by pain, she saw. "She's not just helping," Alma told Will one morning, her voice thin as paper. He was spooning broth into a bowl for her. "She's watching, like someone who's seen real trouble." Will didn't answer, but his hand froze for a second over the table. "You be careful with her," Alma added, her voice even softer. "Not everyone who looks broken actually is." Will didn't need the warning. He'd seen it in Emma, too. The way she moved through a room like she was used to tight corners, used to being told to hurry up, to be quiet, to disappear. He tried to give her space, to treat her like hired help, but it was impossible. Her silence wasn't empty, it was heavy. It was the silence of grief. Their days fell into a rhythm. Will worked the fence lines before sunrise. Emma tended to Alma. They passed each other in the halls with short glances and brief nods. Words were rare, but little by little, small things began to shift. She started leaving a tin cup of hot coffee on the porch rail for him, right where she knew he'd sit before the sun was fully up. He started leaving fresh apples from the old orchard on her windowsill. Their kindness wasn't loud. It wasn't even deliberate at first. But it grew, quiet and stubborn, like a wildflower pushing up through cracked earth. The first real moment between them happened late one evening. A thunderstorm had ripped through, and Will came back from mending a busted section of fence, soaked to the bone and tired in a way that went deeper than muscle. Emma met him at the door with a dry towel. "You don't have to," he muttered, water dripping from his hat. She didn't answer. She just handed him the cloth and turned back toward the kitchen. Something about that simple act, the way she didn't speak, didn't expect a thank you, got under his skin. It wasn't service. It was care. The kind he hadn't felt in a very, very long time. But it wasn't all calm. Will was used to being in control, to shouldering every burden alone. Emma had her own rhythm, a quiet strength that sometimes clashed with his hard-edged world. He didn't like it when she ventured into the tool shed alone. She didn't like it when he barked an order without looking at her. One morning, he snapped at her for overwatering the tomato plants, the only living things in their sorry excuse for a garden. She turned, and for the first time her eyes weren't haunted or sad. They were cold and sharp as ice. "I didn't come here to be yelled at," she said, her voice flat and clear. Then she turned and walked away. That night, he left his apology on her windowsill, a warm plate of stew covered with a cloth. He never said a word about it. But the next morning, the plate was washed clean and left by his work boots near the door. Then Lou Cutter showed up. Lou had been their neighbor once, before the drought forced him to sell off most of his land. He was a mean man with crooked teeth and a cruel streak a mile wide. He still showed up from time to time, uninvited, sniffing around for anything he could steal or bargain for. The first time he laid eyes on Emma, he leered. "Didn't know you were running a boarding house now, Granger," he said to Will, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt. "She a new girl?" The tone in his voice made Will's blood run hot. He kept his own voice level. "She's here to help my mother." Lou just smirked and tipped his hat toward Emma, who was standing still as a statue on the porch. "Well, I'd watch her close if I were you. Strays don't always stay loyal." Emma didn't react. Not a flicker. Not a blink. But that night, Will saw her sitting on the porch long after dark, her shoulders hunched, arms crossed so tight it looked like she was trying to hold herself in one piece. He sat down next to her, not speaking. The stars overhead looked like shattered glass scattered on black velvet. "He said that like I'm something to be traded," she whispered into the dark. "Like that's all I've ever been." Will didn't know what to say, so he didn't try. He just sat there, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and the silence between them was different that night. It wasn't empty. It wasn't sharp. It was shared. As fall wore on, the land softened. The leaves on the cottonwoods turned brittle and gold. The air grew colder, and Alma grew weaker. She started to forget things. Names, days, whole years. Sometimes she'd call Will by his dead brother's name. Sometimes she'd stare at Emma with a confused look and whisper, "Where's the baby?" Emma never corrected her. She would just sit close, take the old woman's hand, and hum a soft tune. It was Emma who found the old quilt, tucked away in a chest by the fireplace. Alma had made it with her sons years ago. It was frayed and faded, but Alma's face lit up when she saw it. For 3 nights, Emma sat by her bedside, helping her mend the stitches. Will watched from the doorway, feeling a knot in his chest he couldn't name. He hadn't seen his mother smile like that in years, but even with this softening, the shadow around Emma never really left. Sometimes in the pale light of early morning, Will would see her outside, her sleeves rolled up to wash her face at the pump. Her arms were marked with faint, old scars. They were faded white, like embers that had long since cooled, but they were there. A map of old pain. And once, when a horse reared up suddenly near the gate, she didn't just jump. She dropped to the ground and curled into a ball, her hands over her head, before she even realized what she was doing. Something had happened to her. Something violent. And no one had asked. Until one night. Alma had fallen into a deep sleep, and Will found Emma on the back steps again, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the darkness. "I lost someone," she said, without him even asking. Her voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. "A boy. He wasn't mine, not really. But I raised him. My sister's son." Will didn't speak. The wind rustled the dead leaves around them. "His father drank," she went on, her eyes fixed on the distant tree line. "Beat him. Beat me. We ran one night, just the 2 of us. We stayed ahead of him for a while. But one winter, the boy got sick. I had nothing left. No money, no medicine. He died in my arms." She said it so simply, like it had happened to someone else. Like the hurt had been burned down to nothing but ash. Will stared at the dirt between his boots, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat. "And the father?" he asked, his voice rough. She didn't answer. For a long, long time, they just sat there in the cold silence. When she finally stood up to go inside, she paused. "You don't have to look at me different now," she said quietly. "I just wanted you to know why I'm quiet." He didn't reach for her, but something inside him cracked wide open, not out of sympathy, but because he recognized it. The kind of loss that rewires your soul, the kind that leaves you walking through the rest of your life with your chest hollowed out. Emma didn't cry that night, but later, alone in the barn, Will did. Quietly, like a man who'd held in too much for too long. After that night, things between them shifted again. Not louder, just closer. They didn't talk about feelings. They didn't need to. Emma started helping him check the fencing in the mornings. Will started letting her handle the account books. She even went into town once, alone, to pick up medicine for Alma. When she came back, unharmed, she gave him a small smile, like she'd won a secret victory. And maybe she had. Then, one afternoon in town, Will overheard Lou Cutter again. He was talking to the clerk at the general store. "She's got a record," Lou said, his voice low and greasy. "Saw the notice myself down in Brazos County. That girl. She ran off after that boy died. Someone said she was hiding something." Will didn't ask what Lou meant. He just turned and walked out of the store. But the seed of doubt had been planted. A small, poisonous seed. That night, he sat up late, staring at the dark window of Emma's room, where her lamp still burned. He didn't want the doubt. He hated it. But it had a way of crawling into the dark corners of your mind when you weren't looking. Emma didn't know what was coming, but she could feel a change. Will's silences grew longer. His glances grew sharper. When she asked if everything was all right, he just nodded and turned away. It wasn't anger she felt from him. It was fear. Will Granger didn't know if he was falling for a woman who had buried a truth so deep it had started to rot, or if he was about to let go of the only light that had come into his life in years. Alma noticed it too. "You look at her like you're scared she'll vanish," she whispered one morning as he adjusted her pillows. "She's not a ghost, Will. Don't you treat her like one. But ghosts don't leave footprints. Emma did. And whatever truth she was still carrying, whatever storm she had walked through to get to his doorstep, he was about to have to face it, whether he wanted to or not, because the past was coming for her, and it was coming for him, too. The first frost came early that year. It coated the fence posts in a hard silver shine and curled the last of the tomato plants into black, withered claws. The sky went dark before supper, and Will found himself glancing toward the house more and more often during his chores, watching for the warm glow of a lantern, listening for any sign that things were still holding steady inside. But they weren't. The silence inside him had shifted again. The warmth that Emma had brought was still there, her steady hands, her quiet presence, but something cold and heavy had crept in between them, something unsaid. It started with a letter. Will found it one morning, wedged into the slats of the porch steps. It was addressed to him in shaky, spidery handwriting, with no return name. He almost tossed it in the fire, thinking it was just some nonsense from a neighbor, but something made him stop. Inside, there was no envelope, no explanation, just a torn piece of paper with 4 short lines scrawled on it. She's not who you think. Look into the boy's death. Ask about the fire. You're not the first fool. There was no signature, no date, just those words. Will stood frozen on the porch, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The cold wind bit right through his thin shirt. The paper trembled in his hand as a slow, sick feeling churned in his gut. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his back pocket. He said nothing to Emma. But his mind spun all day. He tried to tell himself it was nothing. A cruel trick. Lou Cutter, maybe, trying to stir up trouble again. But deep down, he remembered what Lou had said in the store. About Brazos County. About Emma running. That evening, he sat at the dinner table and watched her. She was spooning soup into Alma's bowl, her voice soft, her hands gentle and careful. Alma smiled that tired, gentle smile she'd adopted in recent weeks. Emma looked up once and caught Will staring at her. Her expression froze for just a fraction of a second before smoothing out again. But Will saw it. A flicker of something in her eyes. Was it fear? Or was it guilt? He couldn't sleep that night. He sat on the cold porch steps, the letter in his hands, reading it over and over again in the moonlight until the words blurred. When he finally did sleep, it was shallow and broken. He dreamed of fire, of a child's scream, of Emma running barefoot through thick, black smoke. The next day, without a word to anyone, Will hitched the wagon and rode into town. He didn't go to the general store. He didn't stop at the mill. He went straight to the county clerk's office. The woman behind the desk looked tired and bored. She raised an eyebrow when he gave her Emma's full name, Emma Caldwell. "You said Brazos County?" she asked, her fingers flipping through a battered wooden file box. "I think I remember something. A few years back. A domestic issue. A house fire." Will's throat went bone dry. "Ah, here it is," she said, pulling out a thin, yellowed file. She scanned the page, her finger tracing a line of text. "It says here, sister deceased, minor male child nephew also perished." She paused. "Suspect Emma Caldwell, questioned but released. No charges filed. No one else ever came forward." Will couldn't speak. The air in the dusty room felt thick and heavy, like he was breathing in dirt. The clerk glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. It was a bad one. Folks around there. They thought she did it. But there was no proof. Just ash. And stories. He left town without buying a single thing. He just drove the wagon back home, the words from the file echoing in his head. Suspect Emma Caldwell. They thought she did it. Emma was on the porch with a basket of laundry when she saw him ride up. Her small smile faltered the moment she saw his face. He didn't speak. He just tied up the horse and walked right past her, the anonymous letter still folded in his coat pocket. A new weight, the county file, settled in his gut. She followed him inside. "Will," she said quietly. "What's wrong?" He turned around slowly. His face was a hard, grim mask. "Who were you before you came here?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She stood perfectly still, the laundry basket still clutched in her arms. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb with me," he snapped, his voice sharp with a pain he couldn't control. "The boy, the fire, your sister. Why didn't you ever tell me what really happened?" Emma set the basket down carefully. Her hands were trembling. "I tried," she said, her voice flat. "That night on the porch, I tried to tell you." "No," he shot back. "You said he died in your arms. You didn't say there were questions. You didn't say that people thought you killed them." Emma's eyes flashed with a fire he'd never seen before. "Because I didn't." "Then what happened?" Will demanded, stepping closer, his jaw tight. "Tell me the truth, Emma. All of it." She looked away from him, her gaze fixed on the floor. "We were running," she said, her voice strained. "My sister. She had gotten tangled up with a man. He was dangerous, controlling, violent. He claimed the boy was his, but I think he just wanted another way to hurt her. I tried to get them out. I thought I could protect them. But we were too late." Her voice broke. "That night, the house went up so fast. I don't even remember lighting the lamp. One minute we were all asleep, and the next the whole place was on fire. And the boy?" Will's voice was a harsh rasp. "He was coughing. I tried to carry him out, but the smoke. I dropped him. I burned my arms trying to go back for him, but the roof came down." She finally closed her eyes, as if shutting out the memory. "The sheriff said I must have done it. That maybe I snapped. But there was no proof, just ruin, and no one left to speak for me." Will felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. Every part of him, every instinct wanted to believe her. But that letter, that county report, the silence she'd kept for so long. It all pulled at him like a rope tightening around his neck. Emma stepped forward, her eyes pleading with him. "You think I could have done it? You think I'm capable of that?" He couldn't answer. He just stared at her. The woman who had brought life back into his home. The woman who might have taken it from someone else's. The silence that fell between them was colder and more final than the wind howling outside. For days, they moved around each other like strangers in their own home. Alma felt it, though she didn't have the strength to say much. Emma kept to the far side of the house, doing her chores with her eyes downcast. Will watched her when she wasn't looking, his heart aching and furious all at once. He wanted to scream. He wanted to pull her close and shake the truth out of her. He wanted to believe. But then Lou Cutter came back. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 other men rode in with him, their faces lean and grim. They waited by the fence line while Lou dismounted and tipped his hat with a lazy, cruel smile. "Heard you got a murderer living under your roof, Granger," he said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Funny how trouble always finds a place to land." Will didn't reply. His jaw was clenched so tight he could feel it in his teeth. Lou's smile widened. "You know, the law don't much care what happens way out here. But us folks, we care. We like to keep things clean. You keep her here. You take whatever comes with her." Behind him, one of the men spit a long stream of tobacco into the dirt. The other casually fingered the stock of a rifle strapped to his saddle. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. Will said nothing. He just turned his back on them and walked toward the house. But Emma was already standing on the porch. She had heard every single word. That night, they fought. The quiet house finally erupted. "You should have told me!" he yelled, the words tearing out of him. "You didn't want to know," she cried back, her own voice rising to meet his. "You wanted the quiet version, the one that made you feel good for helping a poor, broken girl. I wanted the truth, and I wanted a place to breathe," she shouted, her face flushed, her eyes wet with tears. "For once in my life, I wanted to be somewhere I wasn't looked at like a problem. You don't have any idea what that's like." Will turned away from her, his fists clenched at his sides. "I gave you shelter. My mother trusted you." "I never hurt her," Emma's voice cracked. "I've done nothing but take care of her, of this place, of you." "Then why does it feel like I never knew you at all?" he asked, his voice dropping to a low, wounded whisper. The room fell silent. Emma stepped back, her face white as a sheet. "Maybe you never tried," she whispered. The door closed behind her so softly he almost didn't hear it. She left before dawn. Will found her note by the cold stove, a few lines written in her neat, careful hand. "I didn't come here to ruin anything. I only wanted to be useful. Thank you for letting me be that for a little while. Tell Alma I'm sorry I couldn't stay." She hadn't taken much, just her satchel and a few of her clothes. Everything else was folded, cleaned, and placed back in the drawers, almost like she'd never been there at all. Alma was silent when Will told her Emma was gone. She just nodded once and turned her head to look out the window. Her voice was dry and low when she finally spoke. "You let fear talk louder than love, son. That's a mistake your father used to make." Will sat alone on the porch that night, the stars blurred by the wind in his eyes. Everything inside him hurt. His chest, his throat, his gut. He didn't know if it was anger or grief or both. All he knew was that something good, something quiet and real, had come into his life. And he had let it slip right through his hands like fine dust. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. But the next morning, something strange happened. A stranger arrived at the fence line. A woman, dusty from the road, older, her face worn with hardship. She asked for Will Granger by name. "I knew her," the woman said, pulling off a worn leather glove. "Emma Caldwell. She helped me once, years back, after my husband left me with 3 kids, and nothing. Took not a penny in return." Will just stared at her, his heart starting to pound. "She came to me again not long ago," the woman continued, her eyes steady and clear. "She was desperate, said she needed help getting her nephew away from a bad man. A real bad man. I gave her what money I had, let them stay in my shed for a few nights to hide." The woman took a deep breath. "I was with her the night the house burned. I was asleep in the shed out back. I woke up too late. All I saw was smoke and flames." Her eyes met Will's. "I didn't come forward then. I was scared. The man she was running from. He had friends. But now, hearing she's out here, still running, I can't stay quiet no more." Will's hands started to tremble. Can you tell the sheriff this?" The woman gave a firm nod. "I already did," she said. "On my way here. They're reopening the file." He rode after Emma that same afternoon. He pushed the horse harder than he ever had before, the dry dust of the road streaking his coat, sweat clinging to his collar. He didn't stop. He asked every rancher he passed, every wagon driver on the road. Most hadn't seen her. A few had. A thin girl, they said. Sad eyes. Headed west. Night fell before he finally found her. She was walking alone near the bluffs, the land dropping off into shadow beside her. Her satchel was slung over her shoulder, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She didn't look surprised to see him. "I thought you hated me," she said softly, her voice raw. He dismounted, breathless from the ride. "I was wrong," he gasped out. "I was a fool." Emma just stared at him, tears already brimming in her eyes. "It's too late." "No," he said, stepping close, his own voice breaking. "It's not." He told her everything. About the woman, about the letter he'd received, about the old, deep fear that had blinded him. He told her he didn't care anymore what some dusty paper in a county office said. He didn't care what the town thought. He knew her pain was real, because it felt just like his own. And for the first time since he'd met her, she let herself truly cry. Not silent tears, not hidden sobs, but loud, aching sounds that broke something wide open between them, right there on the edge of the world. He didn't try to hush her. He didn't promise her safety. He just held her while the wind howled past them, and the vast, scorched land wrapped them both in its cold, dark embrace. Will Granger had once built his life out of silence and hard work. But now, for the first time in years, he wanted more. He wanted her. And this time, he'd fight to keep her. Not just from men like Lou Cutter, but from the cowardly part of himself that had once believed love was too fragile to ever last. He was about to find out just how strong it had to be. The ride back to the ranch was slow and silent. Will didn't rush her. Emma sat behind him on the horse, her arms held lightly around his waist. But there was a distance in her touch, a hesitation in the way she held herself. It was like she wasn't ready to believe this was real. Like some part of her was still expecting him to change his mind, to pull away again the moment the silence between them stretched on for too long. Will felt that hesitation, and he hated himself for putting it there. She was back, but she wasn't safe. Not on the inside. Not yet. When they finally arrived, Alma was asleep. The house was dark, the coals in the stove burning low. Emma stepped inside carefully, moving like a guest returning to a home that was no longer hers. She didn't go to her room. She just sat down in a kitchen chair and stared at the empty table, her hands folded in her lap, her face a blank mask. Will poured a cup of water from the bucket and handed it to her. She didn't drink it. "I don't know how to be here now," she said after a long while. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Not after all that." Will sat down across from her. "Then we'll figure it out." Emma looked down at her hands. "You believed them. For a while." "I doubted you," he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But I didn't want to. I was scared. I didn't know how to carry what you gave me. I didn't think I deserved something good." She didn't say anything. She just folded her arms tighter across her chest. He leaned forward, his voice low and earnest. "Emma, you were right. I wanted the quiet version of you. The easy one. I didn't want to ask what that silence cost you, but I know now. It cost you everything, and I am so sorry I didn't listen sooner." Her eyes were red and swollen when she finally looked up at him. "What happens when I break again?" "Then I'll stay," he said, the words a raw promise. "Even if you tell me to go." But Emma didn't believe in promises anymore. Not the spoken kind. She had learned too well how words could lose their shape in the mouths of men, twisting into weapons. She gave a slow, tired nod, but the ache in the room didn't lift, because even though he had come for her, even though he believed her now, he had still left her to walk alone for days, and a part of her would always remember what it felt like to sleep with her back to a wall, her heart braced, just waiting to be betrayed again. Over the next week, things settled into a kind of rhythm, but it wasn't the old one. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't easy. It was fragile, like thin ice over deep water. Alma's health was failing fast. Her appetite vanished. Her breathing became a labored, painful struggle. She drifted in and out of lucidity. Sometimes she would mistake Emma for her own long-dead mother. Sometimes she would ask Will where his father had gone, as if he'd just stepped out for a moment. Emma stayed by her side constantly. She kept her clean. She whispered softly to her when the pain grew too intense. But she didn't talk much otherwise. Not to Will. Not even to herself. Whatever had cracked open inside her after Will found her on the bluffs had not yet begun to heal. It was still a raw, gaping wound. One night, Will woke to the sound of crying. It wasn't Emma's. It was Alma's. He rushed to the room and found his mother clinging to Emma's hand, her eyes wide with a frantic clarity. "Don't leave him," Alma whispered, her voice surprisingly strong. "He's like his father. He pushes people away when he's scared. But he loves hard. Please, don't go, don't go." Emma's face crumpled in the lamplight, but she didn't let a tear fall. She only nodded. "I'm not going anywhere tonight, Alma." Will stepped back into the dark hallway, his chest so tight he could barely breathe. The next morning, Alma couldn't speak. Her breath came in shallow, rattling gasps, her eyes fluttering. Will sat on one side of the bed, Emma on the other. They held her hands as the life slowly, quietly, left her body. Just before the end, Alma turned her head, just barely, and her lips moved. Emma leaned close to hear the faint whisper, then nodded. When she straightened up, she looked at Will. "She said she's not afraid anymore." When Alma passed, it felt like the very air was sucked out of the house. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Neither of them spoke for hours. Will busied himself outside, digging the grave by the small, withered orchard. Emma moved through the house, gathering Alma's few belongings, folding her dresses, tucking old letters into a small wooden box, wrapping a tarnished silver locket in a piece of clean cloth. The funeral was quiet. There were no visitors, just the two of them, standing in the brittle light of a cold November morning, shivering beneath a vast, empty sky. Afterward, they returned to the house. They didn't touch. They didn't talk. Will poured coffee into 2 tin cups. Emma sat by the cold stove. "You loved her," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Will nodded, staring into his cup. "I think she was the last part of me that still felt like home." Emma looked down. "So what now?" He didn't know. The ranch was falling apart. The fields were bare. The few remaining cattle were thin. Winter was coming like a hammer. And the house. The house suddenly felt too big, and too empty, all at once. That night, Emma sat by the fire alone while Will worked in the barn, needing the physical labor to quiet the noise in his head. She stared into the flames, her mind a million miles away. She thought of the boy, of his laugh, of his small hand clutching her skirt, the way he used to draw shapes in the dirt and tell her fantastic stories about them. She thought of the smell of smoke, and how sometimes she thought she could still feel it clinging to her skin. And she wondered if she had done more, been stronger, seen the danger sooner. Would he still be alive? Her guilt was a thread that never snapped. No matter how many kind words Will said, no matter how many quiet nights passed, it was always there. She began pulling away from Will again. Not completely, not like before, but in small, subtle ways. She stopped humming to herself when she cleaned. She stopped setting out his coffee in the morning. She spent more time alone in the orchard, just staring up at the gray sky. Will noticed, but he didn't know what to do. He gave her space, afraid of pushing her, of making another mistake. But the space between them only grew. Soon, they were just 2 people living in the same house with a ghost between them. The ghost of Alma, and the ghost of a small boy. One morning, Emma told him she wanted to go into town. Alone. Will hesitated, then nodded. All right. She returned hours later, her face unreadable. She had sold some of her old belongings, a bolt of fabric, a few trinkets, an old silver pendant she used to wear. When Will asked her why, she just shrugged. I needed to let go of something. But what she didn't tell him was that she'd also gone to the sheriff's office. She had walked in and told the sheriff everything. The fire, the man who had hurt her and her sister, the boy's death, her escape. She left nothing out. And when he asked her why she was coming forward now, she said, "Because someone finally believed me." The sheriff had listened. More than she had expected. He told her the old case had been closed for years. He told her that while some folks in town might always whisper, the law had no more questions for her. "You've suffered enough, miss," he'd said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Maybe now you can let yourself live. But how do you live with the weight of something you can't ever undo?" That night, she told Will what she'd done. "I went to the sheriff." He looked up from the table, surprised. "Why?" "Because I don't want to be afraid anymore," she said, her voice stronger than he'd heard it in weeks. "Not of myself, not of you, not of this house." Will reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. "I'm still scared," she whispered, her new strength wavering. "Even now, I don't know if I can ever be whole again, if I ever was." "You don't have to be," he said softly. "You just have to stay." But that wasn't a promise either. Nothing was. People left. Houses burned. Truth came late, if it came at all. Still, she stayed that night. She curled up beside him in the bed, not speaking, not touching, just breathing together in the dark. Days passed. The ranch stayed quiet. Will repaired the east fence. Emma began sewing a new quilt from Alma's old scraps of fabric. They began sharing meals at the table again, the silences between them slowly becoming less heavy, more comfortable. The grief was still there. So was the doubt, a faint shadow in the corner of the room. But so too was something else. Something that felt a little bit like warmth. But then came another letter. This time it was addressed to Will. The name on the return line made his blood run cold. Clayton Morris. Emma saw the name too. Her face went white as bone. He was the man. The one she had fled from. The father of the boy. Will tore it open and read the short, brutal message in silence. You think you know her? You don't. She left before they found the other body. She'll ruin your life next. Will crumpled the paper in his fist, a hot fury rising like bile in his throat. He's trying to scare you, he said, his voice tight. Emma sat down hard on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. There was no other body, she whispered. He's lying. I know, Will said. But even as he said the words, the fear in her eyes hollowed out a space inside him. The past wasn't done with them, not by a long shot. Will, she said slowly, her voice shaking, if this man, if he shows up here, he won't. But if he does, she insisted, looking him straight in the eye. I won't let him near you, he said, his voice firm as steel. But they both knew what she was really asking. Will you still believe me? Even then? She didn't need protection. She needed trust. And Will finally understood. He could only keep her if he was willing to trust her enough to lose her. That night, he didn't sleep. He lay beside her, listening to the wind rattling the window panes, his heart pounding. He thought of Alma, and the pain she had carried. He thought of Emma, and how many times she must have woken up alone, walked alone, begged for someone, anyone, to believe her. He thought of himself, the boy he used to be, the man he had become. And somewhere in the dark hours before morning, he made a decision. Whatever came next, he wouldn't flinch again. Even if the whole world tried to burn them down, this time, he would not move. He would hold the line. For her, for the truth. And when the storm came, because he knew it would, he would face it right at her side. The knock came just after sunset. 3 hard, sharp raps on the front door. Deliberate, confident. Will was in the barn, brushing down the gelding. He heard it and froze, his hand tightening around the brush handle. It was too early for a neighbor dropping by, and too forceful for a delivery man. The air in the barn suddenly felt still and thick, like the moment right before a thunderclap. He stepped outside slowly, his eyes narrowing toward the house. The light in the parlor window glowed, warm and steady. Emma was in there. Alone. By the time Will crossed the dusty yard, the door was already open. And there he was. Clayton Morris. He stood on the porch like he owned it. He was tall and broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, but with a rough edge to him. His coat looked expensive, but it was worn. His boots were shined, like he hadn't done a day of real labor in years. But it was his eyes that froze Will's blood in his veins. They were cold, empty. The eyes of a man who believed he owned whatever, and whoever, he touched. Emma had gone pale as a ghost. Her arms were crossed tight in front of her chest, a useless shield. She hadn't said a word. Will came up the steps behind her. Get off my land. Clayton smiled. A slow, slick smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well now, that's not very hospitable, he said, his voice smooth as oil. I only came to see an old friend. You're not welcome here, Will said, stepping forward so he was partially in front of Emma. Clayton didn't even look at him. His eyes never left Emma's face. Emma, he said softly. You ran off in such a rush, left so much behind. I figured you'd be grateful I came all this way to clear things up. Emma's jaw trembled, but she stood her ground. There's nothing left to clear. Oh, I don't know about that, he said casually. Folks might still be curious. You remember that little girl from across the road? The one who swore she saw you carrying something out of that burning house before you screamed for help? Nobody believed her at the time, a scared little kid. But it's funny how stories can change when enough ears are willing to listen. Will stepped fully between them now. You say one more word. Clayton held up a hand, a placating gesture that was anything but. I'm not here to fight. Just wanted to give Emma a choice. He looked around the sagging porch, his gaze full of disdain. Doesn't look like much of a life out here. You think this man is going to protect you forever? What happens when he's gone? When winter hits and this whole place finally crumbles around you? Get off my land, Will said again, his voice lower this time. Dead calm. Clayton's smile widened. It's not your land I want. Will moved faster than he thought he could. He grabbed Clayton by the collar of his expensive coat and shoved him backward, hard, down the porch stairs. The man stumbled in the dirt, but caught his balance before he fell. He straightened his coat with a sneer. You touch me again, Granger, he spat, and I'll make sure every lawman in this county hears about the killer you've been harboring. Will reached for the shotgun he always kept propped just inside the door. Clayton raised both his hands and took a slow step back into the darkness. Not today, he said, his voice light again, but I'll be around. You two stay warm now. He turned and walked off into the night, whistling a low, cheerful tune as he went. Emma stood frozen, staring into the space where he'd been. Will turned to look at her. Her hands were shaking violently. Her breathing was shallow. Her eyes were distant, like she was slipping away from him, right there on the porch. He's lying, she whispered, her voice a thread. I know, Will said. But even as he said it, something inside him twisted. That line about the little girl, about her carrying something out of the house. A crack formed in his resolve, thin as a spider's thread. But it was there, and Emma saw it in his eyes. You believe him, she said, her voice completely flat. Even now. I believe you, Will said quickly, maybe too quickly. But I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Emma's face tightened into a hard mask. I already did. Did you? He asked softly, his heart aching. Emma, what did you carry out of that house? She just stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently. Her lips trembled. I tried to save him, she finally choked out. I went back into the house twice, the second time. I found my sister's body. The boy. He was near the window, curled up. I thought maybe. She stopped, taking a ragged breath. I wrapped him in a blanket. I didn't know he was already gone. I just couldn't leave him there. Tears filled her eyes, spilling down her pale cheeks. I didn't even realize I was outside, standing in the yard with him in my arms, until the neighbor ran up screaming. She thought I'd killed him. She saw the smoke, saw me holding him like that. She thought I'd done it. But I was trying to save him. I was just trying to save him. Will stepped forward slowly and gently, took her by the arms. Why didn't you tell me that part? Because, she whispered, her voice full of a terrible, broken sadness. You looked at me different already. I saw it. The very first time I told you anything, you pulled away. I couldn't bear to see that look in your eyes again. Will felt like his chest was breaking in two. I was afraid, he said, his own voice hoarse. But not of you. I was afraid of losing something good again. Of not being enough to keep you safe. Emma looked down, pulling her arms free. I'm tired, Will, she said, her voice weary to the bone. I'm so tired of having to prove I'm not a monster. You don't have to, he said. Not to me. But the damage had already started to bloom again between them. That night, Will couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching the dark window, listening to the wind. What if the little girl had seen something more? What if there was a part of Emma's past she had buried so deep she hadn't told anyone? Maybe not even herself. Could he still love her? If she had done something unforgivable, in a moment of terror and pain, did it even matter anymore? Emma lay awake too, staring at the ceiling. Her heart thudded in her chest. Not because she was hiding a secret, but because she was exhausted. Telling the truth hadn't saved her. Running hadn't saved her. Even love hadn't saved her. And now, with the past clawing at her heels again, she wasn't sure if anything ever would. In the morning, she was gone again. This time she didn't leave a note. Will just found the front door standing open, her boots missing from their spot by the hearth. The ranch was quiet, cold, and empty in a way that felt brutally final. He rode out, his heart hammering against his ribs, a wild panic seizing him. He prayed she hadn't gone to the river, or to the cliffs, anywhere she could just disappear for good. But he didn't find her there. He found her in town, standing on the wooden steps in front of the sheriff's office. Clayton was standing a few feet away, his arms folded smugly across his chest. Emma's face was blank, her eyes empty. "I came to turn myself in," she told the sheriff, her voice clear and steady. "To answer for everything. I'm tired of running." Will froze, his hand on the reins. "Emma, no." "I need this," she said, not looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the sheriff's door. "I need this to end. I can't live my life waiting for the next letter, the next knock on the door. I want it to be over." The sheriff, a weary-looking man with a gray mustache, looked from Emma to Will, then back at Clayton. "You have some kind of proof?" he asked Clayton. Clayton smiled. "Just my word. And the word of a witness who's now willing to talk." "That's not enough!" Will snapped, dismounting and striding toward them. Clayton stepped forward. "She ran for a reason, Sheriff." Emma finally looked up, her gaze meeting Will's. And in her eyes, he saw not guilt, but a terrifying, resolute strength. "I didn't run because I was guilty," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the morning air. "I ran because no one would believe me. But I believe me. And that has to be enough." Will reached for her hand. "It is," he said desperately. "Emma, please don't let him do this to you." The sheriff sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Look, miss, there's no open warrant for your arrest. The case down in Brazos County is closed, cold. Unless someone wants to come forward with new, hard evidence, I've got nothing to hold you on." Emma just blinked. "So? That's it?" "That's it," the sheriff said with a shrug. Clayton's smug smile fell from his face. Will stepped between them, his body a solid wall between Clayton and Emma. "You come near her again," he said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "You come near my land again, I won't call the law. I'll bury you myself." Clayton stared at him for a long moment, his cold eyes full of hate. Then he turned on his heel and walked away, his back stiff with fury. Emma turned to Will, her eyes wide with a fragile, dawning disbelief. "It's done," Will said softly. "It's over." She shook her head slowly. "It's never over," she whispered. "It just hides." They rode home in silence. The wind was sharp, the land brittle and unforgiving. But something had shifted. Not in the world, in her. That night, Emma sat on the porch alone. Will joined her after the dark had fully settled, bringing a blanket. She was holding the small silver locket Alma had given her. Inside was a tiny, faded photo of Alma's two boys, long before the world had taken one of them away. "She trusted me," Emma said quietly, "even when I didn't trust myself." "She saw you," Will said. "So do I." Emma looked at him, tears building in her eyes again. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice steady. "I don't know if I'll ever stop flinching at loud noises, or doubting a kind word, or waking up in a cold sweat. But if I stay, it's because I choose to, not because I'm healed, not because I'm fixed, just because I want to." Will took her hand, his grip warm and sure. "Then that's enough for me." The wind picked up, and a storm rolled quietly in the distance, lightning flickering on the far horizon. But for the first time, Emma didn't pull away from the sound. The betrayal had come. The confrontation. The nearly unbearable weight of the truth. And yet, they were still there, sitting side by side. That, she realized, was the difference. This time, she hadn't been left alone to carry it. The morning after the storm, the light hit the fields, soft and golden. The ground was still damp from the rain. The kind of rain that washes everything clean, right down to the bone. Emma stepped onto the porch with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The air smelled of wet cedar and fresh earth. She could see Will out by the east fence line, his silhouette steady and sure as he hammered a loose post back into place. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the tightness in her chest had loosened. Not all the way, but enough to breathe. They didn't speak about Clayton Morris anymore. Not because they were afraid to, but because his name had no more weight. After the final confrontation at the sheriff's office, he had simply disappeared, like smoke on the wind. There were no more letters, no more visits. He had tried to use fear like a leash, and when it snapped, he had nothing left. Men like that always move on when their control slips through their fingers. Emma still glanced over her shoulder sometimes. She still startled at the sound of a horse riding up too fast. But the fear didn't own her anymore. She was learning the difference between being alert and being haunted. Their life settled into something real. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was true. They didn't need to talk about love. It was there in the way she started baking extra bread again, just because she knew he liked it. It was in the way he started leaving his worn work gloves by her door. A silent signal that he was back from the fields and would be in soon. It was in the quiet evenings where they sat with their backs against the porch posts, sharing a blanket, watching the sun bleed across the edge of the land. One afternoon, Will brought her a bundle from town. It was an old leather saddlebag, and inside were drawing pencils, brushes, and a pad of fresh, clean sketch paper. "I saw you drawing in the margins of Alma's old letters," he said gruffly. "Thought you might want some real space." Emma smiled, the first full, unguarded smile he'd seen on her face in weeks. She took the paper with both hands, like it was something sacred. And that night, by the soft glow of the lantern, she began to draw again. Not just flowers or fence posts, but faces. A boy's face, smiling. Alma's wrinkled, strong hands. Will's eyes, steady and kind. The past was still there. It always would be. But it no longer felt like a fire waiting to catch. It felt like something she could shape. Something she could turn into a story, or a memory. Or even something beautiful. Later that fall, another letter arrived. But this one wasn't a threat. It was from the town council. The Granger Ranch, it turned out, had been nominated for historical preservation. Alma's hard work, her legacy, had been recognized by someone who had passed through years ago and never forgotten her strength. They were offering funding, a chance to rebuild the barn, to repair the main house. Will showed the letter to Emma in stunned silence. "She would have hated the attention," he said with a small shake of his head. Emma laughed softly. But she would have loved being right. They started to plan small things. A new roof for the house come spring, a fixed water pump for the well. Emma suggested they could open up a part of the ranch for children from town to visit in the summer. Maybe teach them how to care for horses. Maybe let them feel what it was like to belong to a piece of land, instead of being pushed around by the world. Will looked at her then, in that same quiet way he always had. But there was more in his gaze now. Trust, awe, and a deep, abiding gratitude. Winter settled hard and cold across the plains that year. But inside the old ranch house, the fire stayed warm. Emma no longer avoided her reflection in the mirror. She no longer flinched when Will touched her arm. Some nights, she still woke in a sweat, her heart pounding from old dreams of smoke and running. But now, when she woke, there were arms to catch her. Hands that didn't press or demand, but just held. One evening, as the wind howled against the shutters, Emma sat by the fire, flipping through one of Alma's old recipe books. Tucked in the back was a photograph she hadn't seen before. It was Will as a young boy, crouched beside a scruffy-looking dog, dirt on his cheeks, and a bright, fearless look in his eyes. On the back, in Alma's handwriting, it read, "He'll carry everything if you let him. But don't forget, he's got a soft heart under all that weight." Emma showed it to Will. He stared at the picture of the boy he used to be for a long, long time. She always knew, he said quietly. Emma reached out and took his hand. So do I. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of emptiness anymore. It was a silence that held memory, yes, but also something that faced forward. Something steady. One morning, when spring was just beginning to touch the air, they stood by Alma's grave together. The last of the frost had melted, and the earth had begun to breathe again. Emma knelt and laid a small sprig of early wildflowers across the simple wooden cross. I used to think surviving was the same thing as living, she said softly, looking out at the vast open land. But it's not. Will nodded. Living means staying, he said, even when it's hard. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. Are you staying? He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. You know I am. Behind them, the house stood strong. Its bones were old, but they were unbroken. It was a place built by a woman who never let life silence her. And now, it was kept alive by two people who had nearly been crushed by silence themselves. Emma didn't know what the future would look like, but for the first time, she wasn't braced for the worst. She wasn't guarding every part of herself against the next betrayal. She had lived through the fire, and somehow, she still had something left to give. The last message of her story wasn't one she ever spoke aloud. It was in the way she rose each day and faced the wind, the way she finally let herself rest, the way she chose to love, even after the world had taught her not to. Justice hadn't come in the form of a courtroom trial or a grand clearing of her name. It came quietly. It came when the shadows stopped matching the shapes of men. It came when she finally realized she didn't need to explain her pain to anyone to be worthy of peace. And grace, it turned out, was something she had to give herself. There was no final kiss in the falling snow, no swelling music as the screen faded to black. There was just two people, standing together on a piece of land that had taken too much, but had somehow finally given something back. And maybe that was the most honest ending of all. Not a fresh start, but a life, finally lived. If you enjoyed this story, and the strange journey of Emma and Will, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more tales from the places where the light doesn't always reach.